Dr. Sam will start by say 11:5 or 11:6, 7.
Okay, no issue.
Yeah.
No issue. No issue.
So Dr. Sam, it is now 11:07. So we should start our today's lecture. I would request you to give your brief introduction because it is going on records on YouTube. So whosoever is referring this lecture later on, he has a fair idea that who the speaker is. So I'm requesting you to give your brief introduction and try to recap the topic which we have covered in the last because it's a continuation of the same topic, the spinal cord. So I requesting you to just give us a brief recap, and then you can continue with the same topic. Over to you, Dr. Sam.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Nurul. And I welcome all our students who have joined here or who will be using this lecture for further studies in MBBS first prof. So I am Dr. Saim Hassan, Professor of Anatomy at Shaheed Hassan Khan Government Medical College at Mewat, and teaching anatomy for the last 12 years. I had my UG and PG, MBBS and MD anatomy done from Aligarh Muslim University. And I have been teaching both the UG and the PG students of my institute, and invited by various universities also for their examination, MBBS examination, assessments, and for guest lectures. So I would start my topic for today's presentation very briefly. I would give an overview of what we have studied till now. So for that, I am going to share my presentation. So let me share my screen first, just a minute. Is it visible?
Yeah, it's visible.
My screen is visible. Okay, so I should start.
No. Once again, it was visible, but the slide is not appearing.
Okay, just a minute. Just a minute. Just a minute.
Yes, it's visible now. Could you please open? Yes.
Okay. And my video is also visible?
Yes.
Okay, fine.
Let me make you a host. Actually, I think that's why it's a problem. Just hold on.
It created some trouble. Last time when you did the host, it created some problems where I was not able to just disconnecting repeatedly.
Okay. Yes, so it's visible.
Okay, fine. So a very quick overview of what we have studied till now. We are discussing the spinal cord, and we have started with the external features of the spinal cord, and we have discussed the external features. And in the external features, what we have discussed is that there is a part of the CNS, that we have the brain and the spinal cord. Brain is a complex part of the nervous system, as it has much evolved to include many more structures and many more nuclei and subcortical structures are there. But relatively, the spinal cord is a very simplified structure. It's a conical structure, conical elongated structure, which is present within the confines of the vertebral column. And when I say that it is present in the vertebral column, I mean that it is only present in the upper 2/3 part of the vertebral column. Okay, lower 1/3 part of the vertebral column is free of the spinal cord. And this spinal cord, so first of all, we should remember the extent of this spinal cord as it extends from the C1 to the L1 vertebrae. This is very important to remember, that it is extension is between the C1, it is extending between the C1 to the L1 vertebrae. C1 to the L1 vertebrae. What's the importance of this is that in case of newborns, the level is at the level of L3. So as we grow, as from newborn period to attaining say 8 to 10 years of age, what happens is that the vertebral column overgrows the length of the spinal cord. So we have a growth of the growth of the vertebral column, so that it overshoots the growth of the spinal cord and the spinal cord falls behind. Okay, so in the lower 1/3 part of the vertebral column, spinal cord is not present. It is not present. Okay, so you have to remember the extent from C1 to L1, And now this spinal cord is surrounded by certain meninges, and these are the same meninges that are surrounding the brain also. So we have three meninges starting from inner, moving outwards. We have innermost pia mater, then the overlap by arachnoid, and the outermost is the dura mater. Okay, so these three meninges, they are also surrounding the spinal cord. Now what happens? The pia mater, which is inherently attached to the surface of the spinal cord, it is, it is attached firmly to the surface of the spinal cord, and it is forming some modifications. So we discussed these modifications of the pia mater, and that includes a very important modification, that is the phylum terminale. So it is nothing but just the continuation of the innermost pia mater. Okay, so it continues downwards. This is the only layer of the pia mater that continues downward and is attached to the S2 vertebrae. It is attached to the, it is attached to the coccyx vertebrae. It is attached to the coccyx vertebrae. This is attached to the coccyx vertebrae. Okay, so pia mater is attached to the coccyx vertebrae. It goes downwards and it is attached to the coccyx vertebrae. Coccyx vertebrae, the extension of the pia mater. Now, other meninges which are surrounding it from the outer aspect, that is the arachnoid and the dura mater, they are attached to the S2 vertebrae. So the other meninges, they are attached to the S2 vertebrae. Okay, they are attached to the S2 vertebrae at the level of the S2, and the phylum terminal, which is shown over here, it is going downwards and it is attached to the coccyx. It is attached to the coccyx vertebrae. So what is the importance of this fact? Now this fact gives us a very important clinical information that we have pia and the arachnoid matter. We have pia, arachnoid, and the outermost dura mater. Pia, arachnoid, and the outermost dura mater. Okay, so here I have drawn the arachnoid and the dura mater. It contains a fluid-filled space. It contains a fluid-filled space, and this fluid-filled space is called as subarachnoid cistern. It is called as subarachnoid cistern. And what is the importance of this subarachnoid cistern is that it contains the CSF, and we put our needle in this particular space to withdraw the CSF for examination and for clinical, giving injections. That is in the anesthesia. For anesthesia purpose, we utilize this space. Okay, so you have to remember that is the subarachnoid cistern, which is bounded between the on the outer aspect, it is bounded by the arachnoid. So this space is lying below the arachnoid. Okay, then as we move above, the arachnoid is bounded by the dura mater, and above the dura mater we have the epidural space. So these are the external features of the spinal cord where it is covered by the meninges. Now, if there are some other external features of the spinal cord that are visible in the cut section, what you can see in this cut section or the transverse section, that here the spinal cord, here we have some sulci and some fissures. Okay, so we have one anterior median fissure. This is anterior median fissure, and this is posterior median sulcus. So we have fissure. With the help of this fissure, with the help of this fissure, you can recognize that it is the anterior end of the transverse section of the spinal cord, and where you see the septum, then means it is you are looking at the posterior end. So apart from it, there are certain anterolateral sulci also. So we have one anterolateral sulcus from here and the posterolateral sulcus. So we have posterolateral antero. Now this anterolateral sulcus, posterolateral sulcus, median fissure, and posterior median sulcus. Anterior median fissure, posterior median sulcus, posterolateral sulcus, and anterolateral sulcus. It divides this area of the spinal cord into definite regions, and these regions include a part of central part which is called as gray matter, and a peripheral part which is called as white matter. So in this transverse section, you can see this central area which is H-shaped or which is butterfly shaped, and it is around this central canal, this gray area which is around this central canal. This is all gray area which is around this central canal. Okay, here it is the central canal. So it is called as central gray matter. It is further divided into various columns or horns. So we have three different columns of the gray matter. that we refer to as anterior gray column, lateral gray column if it is in the thoracic and the lumbar aspect. So we have one additional gray column that we called as lateral gray column and one posterior gray column. So anterior, lateral and posterior gray column or horns, which are part of the central gray matter. Likewise, in the white matter, we have an anterior white column, a lateral white column and a posterior white column. So we have 3 columns in the white matter and 3 columns in the central gray matter. Central gray matter may be referred to as horns also. They may be referred to as horns also. So if we call it as ventral horn, dorsal horn or the lateral horn, that means we are talking of the central gray matter. But whenever we talk of the peripheral white matter, we always refer to it by the name of the column. That means we will have an anterior column or anterior white column, lateral column or lateral white column. Unless otherwise specified, this column will be referred to in the peripheral part or in the white matter. Okay, so we have an anterior white column, lateral white column or posterior white column. Now, our further discussion will be based on the internal features of the spinal cord. Internal features of the spinal cord. And when I say the internal features of the spinal cord, so now we are going to discuss these internal features both in the central part, that is the internal features of the central gray matter, and the internal features of the peripheral white matter, So what are the internal features in the central gray matter? Now in the central gray matter, the internal features, you have to study or you have to remember that the internal features means now we are talking as it is a gray matter, we are talking of the neurons. We are talking of the neurons and the cell bodies of the neurons, cell body of the neuron. As you are aware, we have a nerve cell that has a cell body and 2 processes are there. It has a cell body and 2 processes. One of the processes is referred to as dendrite. So it is called as dendrite. And another one is the axon, and one is the cell body, and another one is the cell body. So this one is the cell body. Okay, so the collection of this cell body in the central gray matter, why it becomes important, we have the collection of these neuronal cell bodies in the central gray matter. Now what you have to remember is that these neuronal cell bodies or nerve cells, they are forming the second order neurons. They are forming the second order neurons in the central gray matter. Second order neurons. That means they are the second number neuron. So once we will study the tracks, so we will discuss the number of neurons that are involved in taking that information or sensory information to the brain or bringing the motor component or bringing the desired outcome from the central nervous system or brain to the effector organ. We have a number of neurons that are involved in this process. They may number from 2 or 3 or maybe more, or polysynaptic may be there. Okay. So we have a reflexes in the form of monosynaptic or polysynaptic reflexes, some operating at the spinal level and some operating at the higher centers of brain. So there may be second order neurons. So second order means it is second in number in the sensory information carried to the brain. Now in the internal features, you have to remember that we have different types of neurons, named neurons, that are located in relation to a number. And we have assigned that number starting from 1 to 10. And that concept is called as Rex lamina. So there was a scientist who assigned these numbers based upon the function. He assigned these numbers that are called as Rex lamina. And these Rex lamina extends from number 1 to 10. So you have to remember the position of these Rex lamina numbers and the type of the neuron, name of the neuron, the second order neuron. Okay, that means the cell body of the second order neuron that it contains, and also the extent. What is the extent of that neurons, from which segment to which segment, from which level, okay, from which level of the spinal cord initial origin and the total extent, that is the termination of that level of the spinal cord that contains the second order neuron. So once we say that in the central gray matter, we have these neurons, that is the marginal nucleus, substantia gelatinosa, nucleus proprius, nucleus dorsalis, and intermedial nucleus. So what does this mean? This means that we are talking of the sensory neurons that are present in the dorsal horn, from extending from the rex lamina 1 to 6, okay, and the first lamina that is located at the apex of the dorsal horn, okay, that is located at the apex of the dorsal horn. So if this is the dorsal horn, so here lies the apex of the dorsal horn, here lies the apex of the dorsal horn, and accordingly it is divided into various laminas. It is divided into various laminas extending from 1 to 6 in the dorsal horn. Then we have 7th in the central region. Then we have 8th, 9th, and 10th. Okay, 10th is in the central part. Okay, central part. 10th is over here and 9th is over here. 9th lamina, 7th is somewhat over here. So 1 to 6, 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th. Now, what are the various names of the neurons that are present over here in the dorsal gray column, which is sensory? First of all, we have a marginal nucleus. The full name is the dorsal marginal nucleus, which is located in the lamina 1, extending throughout the extent of the spinal cord, and which acts as a relay station for the pain and thermal stimuli, pain and temperature, which relates to the marginal nucleus. Then in the lamina 2, just adjacent to the lamina, in the dorsal horn, we have the substantia gelatinosa, and the extent is on the entire cord. It is also extending to the entire length of the spinal cord, and it modifies the pain sensation. Whatever is received from the lamina 1, it modifies those pain sensations and temperature stimuli accordingly. Okay, so it is also a relay station for pain and thermal stimuli. Then in the lamina 3 and 4, in the lamina 3 and 4 of the dorsal horn, we have a nucleus proprius. We have a second order neuron, the cell body of the second order neuron. The name of the second order neuron is nucleus proprius. The location is entirely located into the entire extent of the spinal cord. And why it is important? Because it is giving origin to the ventral spinothalamic tract. It is giving origin to the ventral spinothalamic tract. That means spinothalamic tract, it is a sensory tract that is carrying the sensations of, maybe it may be any sensation, okay, but specifically spinothalamic, that is carrying the ventral spinothalamic. It is carrying the touch, pressure, vibration senses, okay. Lateral spinothalamic is carrying the pain and temperature senses from the periphery, from the peripheral receptors or the receptors that are present on our skin. So ventral spinothalamic, that is also carrying the sensory stimuli from the receptors like the Meissner's, Paciniers, Merkel's disc or free nerve endings that are present on our skin. It is carrying the sensory information to the brain. So that is the ventral spinothalamic tract. Again, it is located along the entire extent of the spinal cord, and the second order neuron which is forming this tract, that is called as nucleus proprius. Okay, then in the lamina 5th and 6th, we have nucleus dorsalis, also referred to as Clark's column. And why this Clark's column is important? Because it is giving origin to the spinocerebellar tract. It is giving origin to the dorsal spinocerebellar tract. Now in the posterior horn, we have in the lamina 7, we have intermedial nucleus, that is also a visceral afferent nucleus. Visceral afferent or visceral sensory nucleus. That means now it is the relay station for sensory stimuli from the viscera, and that sensory stimuli may be in the form of a pain from the viscera. We have all observed the pain from, say, stomach or GIT, or from heart, or from our other viscera, kidney. It may be from kidney, liver, or spleen. So the pain receptor, the pain fibers from the viscera, and also the pain from the stretch receptors of the viscera. Okay, so it is carried to the lamina 7, which is where there is a location of intermedial nucleus, which is also named as visceral afferent nucleus, and the extent is through the entire spinal cord. So this is in the dorsal gray column. Now in the lateral column, the lateral column is not visible throughout the extent of the spinal cord. It is located between the segments T1, thoracic and lumbar, T1 to L2, and from S1, S2, S3, and S4. So what happens in this lateral column, which is the center for the sympathetic activity, sympathetic and part of the parasympathetic activity, we have the second order neurons. We have a set of neurons that forms the interomedial nucleus. And this is in the lamina 7, and extent is from T1 to L2 segment of the spinal cord, where it gives rise to the preganglionic sympathetic fibers. Preganglionic sympathetic fibers. Okay, it is sympathetic, thoracic, thoracolumbar outflow. And from S2 to S4, they give rise to preganglionic parasympathetic fibers. Now, again, in the ventral gray column, that means here, this is the ventral gray column. In the ventral gray column, again, we have nuclei, but here we have the motor nuclei. That has organized into groups. Here we have the sensory neurons, sensory nucleus or sensory neurons. Okay. In the dorsal horn, we have sensory neurons, while in the ventral horn, we have motor neurons. And what these motor neurons will do, they will innervate the muscles. So the motor neurons, they are again divided into a lateral group of nuclei and a medial group and a central group of nuclei. So if I say that in the ventral horn of this gray matter, the neurons are divided into 3 groups: a medial group, central group, and a lateral group. And what is important to remember of here, that medial group and lateral group, it is innervating the muscles. Okay, it is innervating the muscles. Like the medial group, it is innervating our head and neck muscles. So it is innervating head and neck group of muscles, the medial group. Okay, it is head and neck and trunk. So it is innervating the trunk and head and neck group of muscles, that is the medial nucleus. And the lateral nucleus, that is innervating the limbs and the girdles. Okay, so it is innervating the upper limb and the lower limb, the lateral nucleus. And then we have a central nucleus, that is again, it is consisting of 3 parts, that is one phrenic nucleus, the spinal accessory nucleus, and the lumbosacral nucleus. The phrenic nucleus that extends from C3 to C5. So the root value of the phrenic nerve is from C3 to C5, that innervates the muscles of the diaphragm. The spinal accessory nucleus that extends from C1 to C6, and it innervates the trapezius and sternocleidomastoid muscle. And the lumbosacral nucleus that extends from L2 to S1, and that innervates the unknown muscles. So this is the internal features of the spinal cord, and that is internal feature of the spinal cord, and particularly speaking of the central gray matter, that we discussed in the previous lecture. Okay, so we studied the central gray matter and the external features of the spinal cord in our previous lecture. So that is till here, that was just the revision of the previous class. So now the next today's lecture, we will see the features of the white matter of the spinal cord, that how this white matter it is made up of and what does it contains. Okay, so now we will be focusing our attention on this white matter, on the white matter. Okay, white matter, on this white matter. And how this white matter is organized? It is organized with the help of the sulci, anterolateral sulcus and posterolateral sulcus. The white matter which is between the anterolateral sulcus and the posterolateral sulcus, it is called as lateral column. So it is further divided into columns. You have to remember that it is divided into various columns, and we refer to as columns of the white matter. Okay, columns of the white matter. Now, these columns of the white matter, again, they are divided into 3 groups. That is the anterior column, which is lying between the anterior median fissure, and the anterolateral sulcus. So here it is the anterior column of white matter. The region which is lying between the anterolateral sulcus and posterolateral sulcus. So the region which is lying over here, this is called as lateral column. Lateral column. Lateral column. And the region which is lying between posterior median septum and posterolateral sulcus, this is called as posterior column. Posterior column. Okay. Now you can remember that if it is written the posterior column, or it also means the posterior white column. Okay. And if it is not specified that whether we are talking of the white column or gray column, then you will take it as about the white column. Unless and until it is specified, it is you refer to this as the part of the white matter. Now in the white matter, the three columns, that anterior, lateral, and the posterior column. Now what does they contain? What does they contain? Okay, so now they contains the some neurons, set of neurons that have a similar origin. They have a same origin, then they have the same course, and they have the same termination. That means now they consist of some closely related group of neurons or axons. I would say the axons of those neurons. Okay, now they are how they are connected, how they are related, that they have a common origin. Okay, that means they are originating at the same level from the same nucleus, and they are carrying the same information, and their termination is also the same. So they terminate at the same level. So suppose if we are talking of the second order neurons, that is taking the sensory information, the cell bodies was lying in the posterior horn of this gray matter. But now the axons of this neuron, it will traverse to the opposite side. Okay, and then it will come from the central gray matter, it will come in the white matter, and then it will ascend up. So here you have to remember that this second order neuron, which the cell body is lying over here in the gray matter, in the dorsal horn of the gray matter, as a second order neuron, it is giving its axon. Okay, and that axon is traversing the gray matter, reaching into the white column. That may be anterior white column, or the lateral white column, or the posterior white column. And then the axons of this second order neuron, it ascends up. So they are group of related axons that are arising at the same level from the same nucleus, having the same course, carrying the same set of fibers, carrying the same set of sensory perception, and they are terminating at the same level. That we refer to as tract or fasciculus, and that is called as tract or fasciculus. Okay, it is called as tract or fasciculus. Also, they are referred to as lemniscus. I will tell you when they are called as lemniscus. So for the time being, you remember that whether I am talking of the tract, white matter tract, or I am talking of the fasciculus, or I am talking of the lemniscus, they basically implies the same meaning, that we are talking of the white matter tracts. Okay, the position may vary, the modality of the sensation that they carry, it may differ. Okay, depending upon their location, depending upon the sensory neurons, the modality may differ, and it will depend on the region also. Okay, at which place this tract is present, so that carries different modality of sensation. Now we come on to the named tracts of the white matter. So here you will find that these white matter tracts, they are divided into either ascending or descending tracts of the spinal cord, either ascending or descending tracts. Okay, so either ascending or descending. So basically what happens is that on the body we have a number of receptors. And these receptors can be for the touch, it can be for temperature, it can be for pressure, it can be for vibration, it can be for proprioception, or it can be of muscle tone, posture. We have an impulse from the joint capsule, we have an impulse from muscle spindle. So all these constitutes the sensory information. Okay, so whenever the receptors they are stimulated, they signal. Whenever the receptors are stimulated, the signal are a transmission of a signal is transmitted, and that signal is carried by means of first order neuron, because these receptors they are part of the first order neuron. So they carry this information to the second order neuron, and from the second order neuron, that sensory information is carried to the third order neuron, and then it reaches to the interpreting area of the central nervous system that analyzes that information, and that is located in our thalamus. So after that sensory information, it is all interpreted, and then the third order neurons from the thalamus, it is projected into our sensory cortex, and then it takes the information to the sensory cortex. Now the sensory cortex will order our motor cortex to give an motor impulse, and that motor impulse, again with the help of a neuron or axon of the neuron, it will form the descending tract, and again it will come onto the anterior horn cell of this gray matter, and it will complete the reflex, or it will innervate our muscle, and accordingly we may act to to move our voluntary group of muscles. So here ascending and descending tracts. So first of all, we are going to discuss the ascending tracts. We will discuss the ascending tract. Now, one more thing here I would like to tell you, that these tracts, they are in the form of informational highways. They are in the form of informational highways. Highways of information. Informational highways. Okay, so they are carrying some particular information, whether sensory or motor. Okay, informational highways. So in this way, you will be able to better remember these highways. And what does these highways contain? These highways contains neuronal fibers or axons of the neurons. Which neurons? Second order neurons. The second order neurons, they are the same neurons which had their cell bodies in the, if we are talking of the sensory highways, they have their cell bodies in the dorsal horn of this gray matter. Okay. So they are called as informational highways. So in the ascending tract, they carry all the sensory information in these informational highways, and that sensory information is carried by 6 different group of fibers, and accordingly we have these 6 different ascending tracts are there, or maybe more, 6 or 7, maybe more are there. We will see later on. So important ones are the fasciculus gracilis, fasciculus cuneatus, spinocerebellar, dorsal and ventral spinocerebellar, lateral spinothalamic, and ventral spinothalamic. These are the important ascending tract. The more we will see. Okay, so we have discussed this slide that it is divided into anterior, lateral, and posterior white column, and they are all myelinated, and this myelination is carried out in the central nervous system and in the peripheral nervous system, okay, by the different cells. One is the Schwann cells and one is the oligodendrocytes. So now these tracts, they are ascending, descending, and intersegmental. Ascending tracts that are carrying the sensory information, sensory information, and motor descending tracts that are bringing the motor information, from the higher centers of the brain. And intersegmental means they are the tracts or group of neurons, connecting neurons, that are present only for the short distances within the spinal cord. So, okay, 1 or 2 segments within the spinal cord, either up or down. So 1 or 2 segments or 2-3 segments within the spinal cord. It is located within the spinal cord. Location is within the spinal cord. So they are called as intersegmental. 1 or 2 segments within the spinal cord. So these are all informational highways forming the ascending, descending, and intersegmental tract. So now here we have the details of the ascending tracts. These are all the ascending tracts. Okay. These are all the ascending tracts. These are all ascending tracts. These are all ascending tracts. And what are the names of these tracts? The names of these tracts, they are, you have to remember that we have the fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus that is present in the posterior white column. Okay, in the posterior white column. Then we have posterior spinocerebellar and anterior spinocerebellar. They are present in the lateral white column. They are present in the posterior white column, fasciculus gracilis and cuneatus. The lateral spinothalamic, as the name indicates, lateral, it is present in the lateral column. The anterior spinothalamic, that is present in the anterior column. It is present in the anterior column. Lateral spinothalamic, it is present in the lateral column of the white matter. Anterior and posterior spinocerebellar, they are also present in the lateral white column. And fasciculus gracilis and cuneatus, they are present in the posterior white column or dorsal column. Posterior white column. Then we have some other tracts by the name of spinotectal. Again, they are the ascending tracts that are present in the lateral column. They are also present in the lateral white column. And they are by the name of spinotectal and spino-olivary. That are ascending tracts. They are concerned with the spino-visual reflex. Spinotectal. Okay, it is concerned with the spino-visual reflex. What is the spino-visual reflex? That is the turning of our head and neck to the direction of the visual stimuli. That is spinotectal. Okay, this tectal is a part of the midbrain. We will see later on. And the spino-olivary. While the descending tracts of the spinal cord, they are relatively less in number and easy to remember also, that only we have two sets of tracts. And these two sets of the tracts, they are named as pyramidal. Either they are pyramidal tracts or they are extrapyramidal tracts. They are all grouped together. Extrapyramidal tracts, they are all grouped together. And the pyramidal tracts, they are in one group, and they are also called as corticospinal tracts. Okay, corticospinal tracts. So I think all of you have studied about this corticospinal tract, and it is the main motor tract system of our body, part of the central nervous system, starting from the brain, area 4 of the brain, starting from area 4 or the motor cortex of the premotor area of the brain. Okay, that is the precentral sulcus, area 4 motor area, located in the precentral sulcus, that has the pyramidal cells. And because of that large pyramidal cells, the origin of the fibers, that is a first order neuron, from those large pyramidal cells, they are forming the pyramidal tracts. Okay, so it is important to remember that why it is called as pyramidal, because it is originating from the pyramidal cells. Okay, it is originating from the pyramidal cells of the motor cortex, pyramidal cells. And that motor cortex, which is located just anterior to the central sulcus, that is also called as motor area or primary motor area, or the area 4 of the Brodmann's. Now, as we have the corticospinal fibers, again the pyramidal tract is also consist of corticonuclear fibers. Nuclear. Now, as the name indicates, that it is innervating the nucleus but of the cranial nerves. And the corticospinal, that means it is innervating or going to the nucleus or neuron of the spinal nerve. Okay, spinal nerve. So here it is innervating or it is distributing within the spinal nerve, while the corticonuclear fibers, they are distributing within the cranial nerves. And those cranial nerves, they are responsible for our innervation or the function associated with the larynx, pharynx, head and neck. Okay, our palate, movement of the palate, movement of the tongue, all those activities in our head and neck region, concerned with our head and neck region, they are brought about by the cranial nerves. Okay, cranial nerves. And some of the activities in the viscera also, they are brought about by the cranial nerves. So here they are innervating the pyramidal tracts. It is consisting of the corticonuclear fibers, okay, that are going to be distributed, or they are innervating the nucleus of the cranial nerves 1 to 12. And the location of those cranial nerves are within the central nervous system. They are arising within the central nervous system. That is the difference between the spinal nerves and the cranial nerve. The origin is within the central nervous system, okay, or the brain stem, that is the midbrain, pons, and medulla. So all the cranial nerves that are arising either from midbrain or from the pons or from the medulla. So the pyramidal tracts, the first order neurons, they are going to the brain stem where they are relaying into the nucleus of the cranial nerves, distributing within the cranial nerves, forming the corticonuclear tracts for the control of head and neck movements and associated with the movement of pharynx, larynx, palate, tongue, and this eyeball movements or movements of the associated with head and neck region. In the corticospinal, we have the movements. Now, here it is important to remember this corticospinal are for the skillful voluntary movements. Skillful voluntary movements. Skillful voluntary movements. Now, skillful voluntary movements, they are carried out by the muscles of our hand. Okay, skillful voluntary movements, they are carried out by the muscles of our hand or the smaller muscles of our hand. They are responsible for carrying out the skill movements and they are under our voluntary control. So they are the pyramidal tracts. The details, we will follow the details in the later part of this class. Now, from the pyramidal, let's come on to the extrapyramidal tract. Extrapyramidal. So extrapyramidal means, it simply means that now it is arising from the subcortical areas. It is not arising from the cerebral cortex, because here the pyramidal tracts, they were arising from the cerebral cortex. Okay. So the area 4 motor cortex, that is a part of the cerebral cortex. While here the extrapyramidal tracts, they are arising from subcortical nuclei. They are arising from the nuclei that are subcortical in position. Subcortical. So they are lying subcortical. Subcortical nuclei means that these neurons, that means the collection of the cell bodies of the neurons, because it is the gray matter. So the collection of cell bodies of the neuron within the brain, that is forming the nuclei, but it is lying deep inside the cerebral cortex. So it is submerged inside. It is lying in the deep confines of the brain. So that becomes the subcortical nuclei, and those subcortical nuclei can be located in the midbrain, where that name of that nuclei is the tectum of the midbrain. So it is giving rise to tectospinal tract. Okay, that is again a descending tract. Then red nucleus, if it is arising from the red nucleus of the midbrain and going to the spinal cord, then it becomes the rubrospinal. Then if it is arising, again this red nucleus is the part of the midbrain. So these two are arising from the midbrain. The vestibulospinal, so that means now we have the vestibular nuclei, and that vestibular nuclei is connected to the spinal cord by means of set of extrapyramidal tract. So where this vestibular nuclei is present, it is present in the level of the medulla. Okay, so it is present in the medulla, the vestibular nuclei. Again, the olivospinal, that means it is from the olivary nucleus, inferior olivary nucleus, that is also located at the level of the medulla. And then the reticulospinal. The reticulospinal means it is from the reticular formation. Again, this reticular formation is a part of the brain stem, and more strictly speaking, it is located at the region of the medulla, and also it is located in the region of the pons. So pons and medulla, they have the reticular formation, and from there the spinal cord is connected by means of set of fibers, and that are forming the reticulospinal tract. Now, although the functions of individual tract, it is again, you should be knowing about the individual tract also, but later on in your further course in the MBBS, you will tend to remember the individual tracts also. But here, if we try to discuss the function of the extrapyramidal tract as a whole, so what they do, they are responsible for maintaining the tone of the muscle, posture of the muscle. Okay, tone, posture, and the position of the muscle. So they are responsible for maintaining the tone, posture, and equilibrium and equilibrium. Extrapyramidal tracts that are responsible as a whole. They are concerned with maintenance of the tone of the muscle, tone, posture of the muscle, posture, and equilibrium as a whole, and equilibrium of the body as a whole. So these are the functions of the extrapyramidal tract. Okay. Now for the time being, I leave this upper motor neuron and lower motor neuron, this slide for the time being, because I want to start with the ascending tracts. Now I want to start with the ascending tracts. Ascending tracts. Okay. Ascending tracts. Now what we have discussed in the ascending tracts, that these are the informational highways, and more strictly speaking, these are the sensory informational highways. Okay. Ascending tracts, these are the sensory informational highway. It is a type of sensory informational highway that is carrying the sensory information that ascends from spinal cord to the higher centers, and they conduct the afferent information which may or may not reach consciousness. That means it is important that it may or may not reach the level of the consciousness. Okay, so what does it mean? If the sensory information, it is reaching the higher centers of the cerebral cortex, that means if it is reaching the thalamus, or if it is reaching the thalamus, is relaying that information to the primary sensory area of the cerebral cortex, then they are under our conscious control. So we are aware of that sensory information, like the pain, temperature, okay, like the pressure, like the touch, that are all under our conscious awareness, the sensory information. So it is reaching the higher centers in the cerebral cortex, while there are some of the information that is not reaching our conscious level. Okay, although that information is coming, but it is not reaching our conscious level, and it is reaching at the level of the cerebellum. Okay, so that is under not our conscious level and reaching up to the cerebellum. So the cerebellar pathways, that means the dorsal and ventral spinocerebellar pathways. Spinocerebellar pathways. Spinocerebellar. So that means the information is not reaching our conscious level, and it is reaching up to the cerebellum. Cerebellum. Okay, it is reaching the cerebellum, not reaching our conscious level. Okay, so that means if the spinocerebellar pathways will be affected, then what will happen? So we are not aware of that conscious information. That means the touch, temperature, that will be intact. Okay, that will be, we will discuss later on with the spinocerebellar tract. So the information can be exteroceptive, it can be exteroceptive, or it can be proprioceptive. Exteroceptive means pain, touch, temperature, position, vibration. This is all the exteroceptive information. And whatever information is carried from the muscles and joints. Okay, that means the muscle spindles, the receptors, muscle spindles, and joint capsule, that forms the proprioceptive information. Proprioception, proprioception. Okay, so just remember that proprioceptive information is from the muscle and the joint capsule. And what does it do? It makes aware, we are aware of our position of the limb and the joint. Even if we close our eyes, even if the room is dark, even if we are hung upside down, if suppose somebody has hanged us in the dark room upside down, okay, still if we know nothing about our surroundings, if it is all dark, still we are able to know the position of our limbs, position of our joints, our organization with respect to the space. Okay, that we are all aware of, and that information is why, because it is carried by the muscle spindles and it is carried from the joint capsule. So that information becomes the proprioceptive information, and that proprioceptive information is very important as far as information from the lower limb is concerned. Okay, we will see that lower limb, the position of the lower limb, we are made aware of the position of the lower limb only if our muscle spindles and joint capsule are intact, and they are sending the proprioceptive information. So continuing with the ascending tracts, major ascending tracts, what we have discussed that in the anterior column, here it is the anterior column or the ventral column that is forming the anterior spinothalamic tract. So the location in the anterior column is that of an anterior or ventral spinothalamic tract. And what modality of sensation it is carrying? It is carrying the anterior spinothalamic. Okay, anterior spinothalamic. It is carrying the touch, but light touch. It is carrying the light touch, pressure, itch sensations, light touch, pressure, and itch sensations. Okay. So it is carrying the light touch, pressure, and itch sensations from the opposite half, on the opposite side of the body. The lateral column. Okay, coming on to the lateral column. In the lateral column, we have a number of highways are there. And those number of highways that includes the spinocerebellar, both anterior and posterior, or ventral and dorsal spinocerebellar, that is located in the lateral column. Again, the lateral spinothalamic, it is located in the lateral column. That lateral spinothalamic is carrying pain and temperature modalities. It is carrying pain and temperature modalities. So ventral spinothalamic is carrying touch, pressure, and itch sensations, while the lateral spinothalamic is carrying the pain and temperature modalities. Both are carried from the opposite side. Both are carried from the opposite side. We will see later on how these pathways, they cross over. So just remember that they are carrying the sensory information from the opposite side. Now, in the lateral column, again, we have spinotectal and spino-olivary. The spinotectal, as I told you, that it is concerned with spino-visual reflex, that is turning of our head and neck and trunk. Head and neck and trunk in the direction of the visual stimuli. In the direction of visual stimuli. So they are called as spino-visual reflex. And spino-olivary, it is proprioceptive impulse from inferior olivary nucleus. Proprioceptive from inferior olivary nucleus. Okay, above the C8. Above C8. Above C8. Just remember, we will discuss later on what is above C8. So that means the segments which are above C8, C7, C6, C5, C4. From here, the proprioceptive information from the upper limb, it is carried to the olivary nucleus. Okay, olivary nucleus, and then to the higher center. So to the olivary nucleus by means of spino-olivary tract. That is the ascending tract. And then in the posterior column or in the dorsal column, we have fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus. Gracilis and cuneatus. Okay. The cell bodies of this gracilis, nucleus gracilis and cuneatus, they are lying at the level of the medulla. So we will see it will follow that how this second order neuron, it's how long it is reaching the nucleus gracilis and cuneatus. So what does they carry? The posterior column, it again carries the proprioception, but conscious proprioception. Whether it is going to the cerebellum, then it is unconscious proprioception. It is unconscious proprioception if it is going to the cerebellum. If it is going to the cerebellum, then it is unconscious proprioception. So you have to remember that if it is going to the cerebellum by means of dorsal and ventral spinocerebellar tract, then it is the unconscious proprioception. And among that unconscious proprioception, we have dorsal and ventral. The dorsal carries the information from the same side. If you remember the Clark's column, okay, you remember the second order neuron in the Clark's column. So that means that Clark's column, it is giving rise to the dorsal spinocerebellar tract. Okay, so the axon of the second order neuron, which is forming the Clark's column, located in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord and then reaching up to the cerebellum, carrying the unconscious proprioception, but from the same side. Whereas the ventral spinocerebellum, again carrying the unconscious proprioception, but from the opposite side. Here, this is the spinocerebellum. So in the posterior column, fasciculus gracilis and cuneatus carrying the conscious proprioception, okay. And that proprioceptive information is for fine touch, localization, and impulses from leg and lower part of the trunk. Okay. So now again, we have classified on the basis of sensation, that the name of the tract on the basis of sensation, like the pain, which is carried by the lateral spinothalamic tract, and the location is in the lateral white column. The temperature, again, taken by the lateral spinothalamic tract, location is the lateral white column. The crude touch pressure and itch, which is carried in by the anterior spinothalamic tract, and the location is in the anterior white column. Fine touch, here this crude touch, that is the deep touch, and the fine touch, which is the superficial touch. So the fine touch is carried by the posterior column in the nucleus gracilis, fasciculus gracilis, and fasciculus cuneatus in the posterior white column. And the conscious proprioceptive information. Conscious means it is going to the higher centers of the cerebral cortex. Again, by the posterior column, because it is a proprioceptive information. So it is all carried by the posterior column. The information from muscle, spindles, and the joint capsule. Okay. And the 2-point localization and discrimination. 2-point localization, we are able to localize the 2 points that are close together. And the tactile discrimination, we are able to differentiate between the touch, different modalities of touch. So they are all carried by the posterior white column. And the unconscious proprioception, that is carried to the spinocerebellar tracts by means of lateral white column to the cerebellum. So thus this information is just to divide the sensations in the spinal tracts or in the sensory pathways or sensory highways. The information is divided on the basis of the sensation that is associated with a particular named tract, and the named tract is located at a particular or fixed position in the spinal cord. Now, how does these tracts they are organized? How do these tracts are organized? I have been taking the name of the first order, second order, and third order neurons. So what are these? They are named in number. That means first order means first neuron, or it is the first neuron, or that is carrying the sensory information from the body, from the skin. So that is first in number, that is called as first order neuron. Then this neuron, it relays the information to the second order neuron. It relays the information to the second order neuron. It relays the information to the second order neuron, and that second order neuron, it takes the further information to the third order neuron. So basically this ascending pathway and descending pathway, the difference is that here we have 3 different neurons or 3 number neurons, 1, 2, and 3. Accordingly, we have named it as first order, second order, and third order. That is taking the information or sensory information to the higher centers. While the descending pathway, that means the corticospinal or the pyramidal tract, that is only the 2 neuronal pathway. Okay. The 2 neuronal pathway means we have one upper motor neuron or UMN and one lower motor neuron or the LMN. Okay, so the descending tract or the pyramidal tract. Here we are talking of the ascending tract. But what happens with the descending tract? So you should remember over here that descending or pyramidal tract, it is only a 2 neuron pathway. So we have one upper motor neuron and one lower motor neuron. So whether you call it as first order neuron or the second order neuron, they are only the 2 order neurons in the descending, and that in the descending we have pyramidal and extrapyramidal both. So I am talking of the pyramidal tract. In the pyramidal tract, we have only the 2 neuronal pathway, that is the upper motor neuron and lower motor neuron. Okay, in the pyramidal tract, not in the extrapyramidal, because extrapyramidal, it is polysynaptic. It has more than 3. Extrapyramidal is polysynaptic, more than 3. So if somebody asks you in your viva that how does this ascending and descending tracts they differ? So they differ into the number of neurons. So we have first order, second order, third order neuron in the ascending tracts, while in the descending tracts, and that too in the pyramidal tracts, we have only the two order neurons, that is upper motor and lower motor neuron, while in the extrapyramidal system, we have a number of neurons, and that makes it as polysynaptic. Why polysynaptic, the extrapyramidal? Because extrapyramidal, I told you that it is connected with the subcortical areas. And in the subcortical areas, if you have studied, then you remember that there is one nuclei that we call as basal ganglia. Basal ganglia. Okay, that is consisting of the group of the neurons or group of the nuclei of the basal ganglia, whether it is the striatum or globus pallidus or caudate nucleus. So we have in extensive connections of this subcortical nuclei of the basal ganglia with our cerebral cortex. So this basal ganglia, it acts as a seat for planning and programming also. Planning and programming also. So that's why it makes the extrapyramidal system as more complex, involving more number of neurons, involving multi-synapses, okay, polysynaptic or multi-synapses, because they have to do the planning and programming also, and then accordingly they have to give order to the motor cortex to execute the function. So I told you in the extrapyramidal system that it is concerned with the maintenance of tone, maintenance of posture, and maintenance of equilibrium. So you can also remember that this polysynaptic extrapyramidal, it is also concerned with the planning and programming of the movements. That makes it this extrapyramidal as more complex, okay? And the pyramidal is only concerned with the execution of the voluntary activity, execution of our voluntary skillful movements, and that too is skillful, okay, skillful, because extrapyramidal does not makes it skillful. It makes it as force because it is involving the large group of muscles. It is innervating the large group of muscles, whereas there's pyramidal, it is innervating only the smaller group of muscles, and those are smaller group that are responsible for performing fine movements. So you remember the difference of the pyramidal and the extrapyramidal. You remember the difference of the upper motor neuron and the lower motor neuron, that is in the pyramidal system, upper motor and lower motor. And you remember the difference of the ascending and the descending tracks. Okay. The three order neuron pathway is the ascending pathway. Two order upper motor, lower motor neuron is the pyramidal pathway. Again, polysynaptic, three or more order neurons. A more complex network, a more complex synapse involves the extrapyramidal system, where it is concerned with maintenance of tone, posture, equilibrium, and planning and programming. That part which is concerned with the basal ganglia. Okay, the part which is concerned with the basal ganglia. So this is about the organization. Now we will discuss UM and MLM also, and we will discuss pyramidal and extrapyramidal also. But once we will start with the descending tracks. Here we will discuss once we start with the descending tracks. Right now we are focused on the ascending pathway or the ascending track. Okay. So now here, what is shown in the diagram? What is shown in the diagram is the neurons in a sensory pathway. The concept of first order and the second order neuron. What you can see over here, this is some sort of receptors present in the skin, and that is the free nerve endings that are responsible for pain, temperature, and light touch. And this first order neuron, it has one, this is the peripheral process of the first order neuron. This is the peripheral process. This is the cell body of the first order neuron. And you should also remember that this cell body of the first order neuron, this neuron is running in the spinal nerve, because from the spinal canal, spinal cord, number of spinal nerves that are arising. Okay, we have 31 pairs of the spinal nerve. Though we forget, I forget to tell you about that part also. There are 31 pairs of the spinal nerves, and these spinal nerves that are connected by means of ventral root and the dorsal root. And in the dorsal root, we have a swelling, and that swelling is called as dorsal root ganglia. So what does it contain? The ganglia or the nuclei. It means the same thing, but just the ganglia is the collection of cell bodies outside the CNS. So that means it is lying outside the CNS. CNS will include both the brain and the spinal cord. But once we call it as nuclei, then we will also always refer that nuclei as the collection of cell body of neurons, but it is lying within the CNS. That means that either it is lying in the brain or it is lying in the spinal cord, but it will never be outside the spinal cord. Outside the spinal cord, the collection of the cell bodies will always be referred to as ganglia. So here in the dorsal root of the spinal nerve, we have a localized swelling, a region that we call as dorsal root ganglia. And that dorsal root ganglia is important because it contains the cell body of the first order neuron. So if it is asked that where is the cell body of the first order neuron of the ascending pathway, all the ascending pathways, all, whether I am talking of spinocerebellar or the fasciculus gracilis cuneatus or the spinothalamic, all these 6 major ascending tracts, they have the first order neuron cell body located within the dorsal root ganglia, and it is giving one peripheral process which is going by means of a spinal nerve reaching up to the skin where it is connected to the receptor. It has receptors on the skin, and a central process. So this is the central process of the first order neuron. Okay, so this is the central process. So it has one central process and peripheral process. And now here it innervates, it reach where, depending upon the pain and temperature. If it is bringing the pain and temperature, then it reaches the substantia gelatinosa. You remember the dorsal marginal nucleus, that is for the pain and temperature. Then the modification of the pain. Okay, that means which type of pain it is, that occurs in the substantia gelatinosa. So here the second order neuron, where do they lie? They lie in the substantia gelatinosa. Substantia gelatinosa. Or you can just remember that substantia gelatinosa is the name of the second order neuron that has cell bodies over here. So the second order neuron that traverses the central gray matter, then it becomes a part of the ascending tract as it comes in the column, as it comes in the lateral column or in the ventral column. So if it is for the pain and temperature, that is carried by the lateral spinothalamic tract, lateral spinothalamic tract. Then this lateral spinothalamic tract, the position is in the lateral white column. So it ascends up in the white column. That is the cell body is present over here. Cell body of the second order neuron is present here in the dorsal horn, while the axon, okay, the single neuron. So you can now imagine the length of this single neuron. Also, you can imagine the length of this single neuron. This is a single neuron. It has such a large length so that it arises from the spinal cord on one end, and you can trace that single neuron up to the, say, the tip of your fingers. Okay, you can trace it over here. That is a single neuron, single long, is the peripheral process of a single neuron. That is the first order neuron. Likewise, the second order neuron. But here a very important thing to remember is that second order neuron, in whichever ascending tract you are studying. Okay, just remember the second order neuron always cross to the opposite side. This is the property of the second order neuron. Okay, that it always crosses to the other side. So if it is bringing the sensory information, it will cross. Whether it cross over here at the same level, or it crosses 1 or 2 segments above in the spinal cord, or it crosses in the brain stem. But if it is bringing the sensory information and it is the second order neuron of the ascending tract, then it will always cross. Okay, so now you have seen that it has crossed from this from this right to left side in the lateral column. Then it ascends up as a process of this long axon of the second order neuron, and then it is reaching the subcortical nuclei. Here this subcortical nuclei is represented by thalamus. So now here it contains, what is thalamus? It is nothing but just the third order neurons. Will start from here. So it is a collection of cell bodies of third order neuron. So cell bodies of third order neuron. Cell bodies of third order neuron. So now it is clear that why it is called as subcortical nuclei, while thalamus is called as subcortical nuclei, because here a number of identical fibers that have the cell bodies of the third order neuron that are bringing the different modalities, or same modality of the sensation from the periphery, it is relaying into the thalamus. Okay, so now the cell body, this is the cell body of the third order neuron, which is lying in the thalamus. Then it gives an axon or the long process that takes this third information from the third order neuron to which area? To the sensory cortex. Okay, to the sensory cortex. And this sensory cortex is located just posterior to the central sulcus. And Brodmann number of this area is area number 312. 312. That takes the sensory information to this area, and that sensory information is connected to the motor cortex. Okay. So this is the brief overview of the neurons that you will find in the sensory pathway. Now we will discuss it one by one. One by one we will discuss it. As here in this figure, what we are seeing the posterior column pathway. We are seeing the posterior column. Okay, we are seeing the posterior column tract. Posterior column, or we can also name it as dorsal column. So in the books, you will, majority of the times it is the dorsal column. It is dorsal column. So I will advise you to remember it by this name only, the dorsal column. Okay, the dorsal column. And the full name of this pathway is the dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway. The full name is dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway. Lemniscus pathway. Okay, so the full name of this pathway is the dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway. Lemniscus also means almost the same. It is a part of the tract. Okay, some similar type of nerve fibers forming a bundle, coming together, forming a tract, but we are calling it as lemniscus. Okay, why we are calling it? Just I'm going to explain. So this is a dorsal column. So what you have to remember about the dorsal column, it is a part of the ascending tract, having their receptors in the skin, in the muscle spindles. Okay, because what information it has to carry? It has to carry the conscious proprioception, and it has to carry the tactile information. That means it is able to differentiate between the tactile localization. It has to do the tactile localization and tactile discrimination. So it has to discriminate between the different types of touches. So accordingly, this information from the posterior column, the information is carried is the proprioceptive information. I write over here in the short that you should remember is the proprioceptive information. Proprioceptive means from the muscle spindles and joint capsule. Okay, muscle spindle or joint capsule, that means from the muscle tendons, the receptors for this proprioceptive information. It can be the muscle spindles or free nerve endings. Okay, so proprioceptive information plus it carries the tactile information, tactile localization and tactile discrimination. That means we are able to differentiate between various modalities of touch, whether it is 2-point discrimination, 2-point discrimination. Okay, 2-point discrimination means, what does it mean? 2-point discrimination, that 2 points placed close together within a very short area on the skin, then the patient is able to appreciate that he is being touched by 2 different positions at 2 different local places. He is touched by 2 different places. So that is called as 2-point discrimination. Also called as tactile localization and tactile discrimination, and the proprioceptive information. Another important information that is carried by the posterior column is that it is called as sterognosis. What is the meaning of the sterognosis? Sterognosis means that we are able to appreciate the shape of any object. If suppose you are given a mobile and you are in a dark room, just looking at the shape of the mobile, just trying to feel the shape of the mobile, you will be able to tell that this is the mobile, or this is a hard surface, or this is the shape of a oval, or this is the shape of a pencil, or this is the shape of a. So you are able to identify the object even if your eyes are closed. Even if you are in the dark room, you are able to tell the shape of the object, and that is called as sterognosis. And that is the property, or the sensory information is carried by the posterior column or dorsal column, the full name of which is dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway. So here the receptors, they are carried by from the trunk or from the lower limb. Okay, all these are the receptors that carry the first order neurons. The cell body is lying in the dorsal root ganglia. This is the same case. Cell body is lying in the dorsal root ganglia, and they reaches the dorsal column. Now you remember that region which give rise to the second order neuron. So it reaches the dorsal root ganglia, it reaches the second order neuron. And that second order neuron, it takes the information to the within the spinal cord. Within the spinal cord, you can see the long central process of the first order neuron. This is the long. So it traverses the spinal cord from the lower level. That is, if it is bringing from the lower limb, that is at the level of L3 or L4. And then it is carrying the same central axon of the first order neuron is carrying the information to the medulla. So it traverses the whole length of the spinal cord. From L3, it comes to the C1. And then from C1, it enters the medulla. In the medulla, it is all first order neurons. See the length of the first order neuron. In the medulla, now here in the dorsal column, in the medulla, this is the section of the medulla, you will see the two nuclei. One is the nucleus cuneatus, and another is the nucleus gracilis. So this is the nucleus gracilis. We have two nuclei that is present at the level of medulla. In the which region of the medulla? In the dorsal column. We have a nuclei, that is a collection of the cell body of number of which neurons? Second order neuron. Okay, so now the modality of the sensation, that is the proprioception and tactile localization discrimination. Now you see that second order neuron now lies over here. Okay, so the second order neuron, I told you, it always crosses, whether at the spinal level or at the higher level. Here you can see from the nucleus gracilis and cuneatus, the second order neuron is crossing to the opposite side. From the right side, it has come to the left side, and from the left side, it will come to the right side. So it has crossed over. And after it has crossed over, the second order neuron, it forms the lemniscus. That is called as medial lemniscus. Okay, so it is very important to remember that now it forms a medial lemniscus. It is forming the medial lemniscus. So what is the medial lemniscus? It is nothing but just the second order neurons. After the second order neurons, they arises from the nucleus gracilis and cuneatus at the level of the posterior column of the medulla. They crosses by forming a great sensory decussation. So here you can see a great sensory decussation is taking place over here. At the level of the medulla, a great sensory decussation is taking place. Great sensory, I am calling it as great, but you just remember that it is a sensory decussation where it is taking place at the level of the medulla. Okay, medulla. And where in the medulla? In the anterior region, just anterior to the central canal. So that is called as great sensory decussation. Basically, at the region of the medulla, just as the name has come, I would like to mention over here, if you are studying the neuroanatomy, then the two most important things that you have to remember, okay, while studying the section of the brain stem and that section of the medulla, you have to remember the great sensory decussation and the motor decussation. Motor decussation is at the level of the pyramids. So we have the pyramids in the medulla where there is occurring the crossing over of the pyramidal tracts. Likewise, there is sensory decussation almost, okay, in the medulla, okay, slightly higher up. Okay, medulla first, in the lower part of the medulla, we have pyramidal decussation, and in the central part of the medulla, in the central region of the medulla, in the central part of the medulla, we have the sensory decussation. So we have the sensory decussation, and the fibers, they are called as internal arcuate fibers that are undergoing this sensory decussation. So it is called as internal arcuate fibers. So sometimes it is also asked in your viva that what are the internal arcuate fibers? They are nothing but just the internal decussation fibers of the second order neurons arising from the nucleus gracilis and cuneatus. Now this second order neuron, it travels within the medial lemniscus. That's why it is called as posterior dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway. And it is taking this modality of sensation to the thalamus. Again, in the thalamus, we have different neurons, different nuclei by the name of VPL, ventroposteromedial, ventroposterolateral, different modalities. It is the seat The thalamus is the seat, highest seat of the sensory information, interpretation of the sensory information. If you remember nothing, just remember that highest level, that interpretation of the sensory information, it is all done in the thalamus. So it is a seat of the sensory centers. It is the main sensory seat of the sensory center in the brain. So it reaches the thalamus. Now in the thalamus, again, we have the third order cell bodies, the neurons, okay, that carry this sensory information for the reciprocal action. First of all, it will carry to the sensory cortex by means of third order neuron. So this is the first ascending pathway that we have discussed, the name of which is called as dorsal column, posterior column, or medial lemniscus pathway. Okay. Now coming on to spinocerebellar tract, spinocerebellar. Okay, spinocerebellar. One line, if you have to remember about spino, there's an unconscious proprioception. Unconscious proprioception. Unconscious proprioception. That means you are not aware of this proprioception, but it maintains. So that proprioceptive information from the lower limb will help you to maintain the posture. So this unconscious proprioceptions help you to maintain the posture. Okay, to maintain the posture. So what happens? We have the dorsal and the ventral spinocerebellar. You already know the location, that it is in the lateral column of the spinal cord. This is the dorsal one, dorsal spinocerebellar, dorsal or posterior spinocerebellar. Okay, and this one is the ventral or anterior spinocerebellar. Ventral spinocerebellar. So that our dorsal spinocerebellar just neuron from the cell body dorsal root ganglia. Again, it relays. So third order neuron lies over here. That is the dorsal spinocerebellar. It lies in the Clark's column. Dorsal spinocerebellar. It lies in the Clark's column. Okay. So it relays in the Clark's column, and then the second order neuron from the Clark's column, it ascends in the same side. It ascends on the same side, and it carries the information to the via the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So what is this peduncle? This is the connection of the cerebellum. With the spinal cord by means of inferior cerebellar peduncle. We have superior, middle, and inferior cerebellar peduncle. So from the medulla, it is connected. This is the medulla. This part is called as medulla of the brain. So it is connected to the cerebellum by means of inferior cerebellar peduncle. And this is the dorsal spinocerebellar tract that is carried in the Clark's column. Just remember the unconscious proprioception. The ventral spinocerebellar tract, on the other side, it crosses to the opposite side. The first order neuron in the dorsal root ganglia, and then it crosses to the opposite side, and then ascends up at the anterior spinocerebellar tract. Okay. Just you have to remember that this anterior spinocerebellar tract, again, it will cross. So the crossing over takes place at two levels. One at the level of the spinal cord where it crosses the opposite side, then again it crosses to the same side. But here it crosses at the level of midbrain. Here it crosses at the level of the midbrain. So here it is the midbrain. So just remember the ventral spinocerebellar that ascends in the anterior lateral column of the lateral wide column of the spinal cord. It crosses first at the same segment of the spinal cord, and then it ascends up on the opposite side, and then it again crosses over and becomes comes to the opposite side through the superior cerebral peduncle, where it is connected. The midbrain is connected to the cerebellum. So this is the anterior spinocerebellar tract. Anterior spinocerebellar tract. This one is the anterior spinocerebellar tract. Both are concerned with unconscious proprioception. So we have discussed the two ascending tracts. That is the posterior column one and the lateral column spinocerebellar tract. Now we come on to the other important one, is the spinothalamic. Spinothalamic. And the spinothalamic, you have to remember, again, they are two in number. We have one lateral spinothalamic and ventral or anterior spinothalamic. Another important information that you have to remember is that lateral spinothalamic is carrying which modality of sensation? It is carrying pain and temperature. It is carrying pain and temperature. This is the most important thing that you have to remember. Pain and temperature is carried by lateral spinothalamic tract, and ventral spinothalamic tract, it is taking the vibration position. Okay, pain, temperature, pressure. It is carrying the pressure, vibration, and touch. Okay, touch, light touch or deep touch. It is carrying the fruit touch or deep touch, which is carried by the lateral ventral spinothalamic tract. The fine touch is carried by the posterior column, or the light touch is carried by the posterior column. Crude touch. It is carrying the crude touch. So here, just remember that the lateral spinothalamic tract is carrying the pain and the temperature, by the lateral spinothalamic. Anterior spinothalamic, touch, pressure and vibration. Which touch? It is basically the light touch. Okay, crude or light touch. Deep touch, that was carried by posterior column. And the fasciculus gracilis and cuneatus, that is in the posterior column, they are carrying discriminatory touch. I have told you what does it mean by discriminatory touch or 2-point tactile localization or discrimination. Vibration and information from the muscle and joints. Okay, I have told you in detail. Then the spinocerebellar, that is the unconscious proprioception from muscle, joints and the skin. So this is the sensory modalities. Now other tracts that are the part of the ascending, other tracts that include the spinotactal, spinoreticular and the spino-olivary. Okay, just remember that it is for the spinovisual, and it is from the spinal cord to the tectum of the midbrain. Okay, tectum of the midbrain that is concerned with the visual stimuli, turning of the head and neck to the visual stimuli. So that are forming the part of spino-visual reflex. The spinoreticular, that is keeping our that aware of our surrounding, awareness. Okay, that is the wakefulness or awareness, and that is by the reticular formation. So spinoreticular tract that is carrying information to the reticular formation from muscle, joints and skin to the reticular formation. And olivary, it is an indirect pathway to the cerebellum. Now, if you want to go in detail of the olivary, I can tell you that it is carrying the unconscious proprioception, from the upper limb, unconscious proprioception from the upper limb. That is an indirect pathway to the cerebellum. Okay, why? Because the Clark's column does not extend beyond C8. The Clark's column is located till C8 only. Okay, it does not extend beyond above C8. So what will happen? How the proprioceptive information will go above C8? Once the Clark's column or the nuclei does not exist of the second order neuron, then how it will go? So that means above this level, that will respond with the level of the upper limb, the unconscious proprioception. It takes an indirect pathway to the cerebellum by means of the spino-olivary tract. So it becomes important because here it is above the C8 segment. That means from C7, C6, C5, C4 onwards, it takes the unconscious proprioception to the cerebellum. And that makes it important because the nucleus dorsalis or the Clark's column is absent at this level. Spinothalamic, that is for the pain and temperature. Okay, they all cross over to the opposite side. Remember, the pain and temperature, they cross over to the opposite side. Okay, pain and temperature. See, the pain and temperature, spinothalamic, it is crossing to the opposite side. Forming the lateral spinothalamic, and it ascends 1 or 2 segments higher up. In the spinal cord, forming the ventral spine. Those does not cross, they ascend 1 or 2 segments higher up, and then they cross at higher level, but they are crossing to the opposite side. Again, they are also the second order neurons, so they must cross. So they are forming the lateral and ventral spinothalamic. So they are bringing the information from the opposite side. So this you have to remember, that the lateral spinothalamic tract, they bring the information from the opposite side. They bring the information from the opposite side. Anterior spinothalamic, this we have discussed already. Touch pressure and light touch. Posterior white column, we have discussed already. It is the discriminative touch, or it is the vibration sense, or it is conscious proprioceptive information that we have discussed in the posterior white column. What will happen if the posterior white column, it is involved in some disease? What will happen if the posterior white column is involved in some disease? Suppose I will tell you that there is a clinical condition that you might have heard the name of syphilis. Syphilis. Have you heard the name of syphilis? Syphilis. Syphilis. Okay, syphilis. It is a disease that is caused by some microorganism, treponema, that causes the syphilis. Some microorganism causes this disease, and in this disease, what happens? That posterior column pathway is affected. Posterior column pathway is affected. Okay, posterior column. So the patient will not be able to differentiate all these information. So the conscious proprioception from the lower limb will be involved. So once the conscious proprioception from the lower limb is involved, then the patient will not be able to remember the position of the lower limb, where he has placed the lower limb, all that information, the position of the lower limb, he will not be known to him. And that is the first clue in the diagnosis of syphilis, that he is not able to maintain the position of the lower limb. He is not able to maintain the position of the lower limb. This is the first clue in the diagnosis of syphilis, that the patient is not able to maintain the position of the, what I tell you, that the position of the lower limb. Because what happens is that posterior white column, it is responsible for the maintenance of all those things. I told you that it is maintenance of position, and how this position is maintained. Position is maintained by all these conscious proprioceptive information that is going to in the brain. So once this conscious proprioceptive information is disturbed, then what will happen? It will affect the equilibrium and the position of the lower limb. Okay, so this is the first information, first clue for the diagnosis of syphilis, that the position of the lower limb is not maintained, and he is not able to tell you about these modalities of sensation from the lower limb. Posterior spinocerebellar tract, then we have discussed posterior spinocerebellar, anterior spinocerebellar, we have also discussed. All these are for the unconscious proprioception. Now we conclude this anterior column. We are going to conclude this anterior column, or the ascending tracts. We are going to conclude these ascending tracts. Okay. With this slide, we will conclude the ascending tracts, and then we will discuss the descending tract. So in the ascending tract, what we have studied: spinocerebellar, fasciculus, gracilis, cuneatus, lateral and anterior spinothalamic. These are the name of the tracts. The location we have studied, where they are located, and the origin and termination and function. We will see the origin, termination, and function. Like the fasciculus, gracilis, cuneatus, they are located in the posterior column, and the origin is the central process of the cells of dorsal root ganglia. So this is the first order neuron, is the dorsal root ganglia. Okay. And the fasciculus, gracilis, and cuneatus, important thing, they ascend on the same side. So they are uncrossed. But now the second order neuron will cross, forming the great sensory decussation. So they terminate at the nucleus, gracilis, and cuneatus. From there, the second order neurons, they will cross, forming the great sensory decussation. So what it will carry? It will carry the position, body position, joint movement, vibration, deep touch, and fine touch. Okay. Touch. Which type of touch? Fine touch by the posterior column. And deep touch or crude touch by, it is carried by this spinocerebellar. Okay. That is spinothalamic. This spinothalamic. It carries the touch, spinothalamic. It carries the deep touch. Deep touch. So in the anterior spinocerebellar, unconscious proprioception, unconscious proprioception. Okay, in the posterior spinocerebellar, again in the lateral white column, Clark's column, cerebellum, unconscious proprioception. Then in the lateral spinothalamic, that is concerned with pain and temperature sensation. The location is in the lateral white column. And which fibers? The second order neuron, that is the nucleus proprius, give rise to the lateral spinothalamic tract. And the anterior spinothalamic tract, that is for the deep touch, pressure, and itch sensation. And it is located in the anterior white column. So this is about the ascending tract. Now we come on to the descending tracts. Descending tracts. Here again, we will discuss some of the important basic information of the descending tract that I told you that this descending tract pyramidal is a 2-neuron pathway. Pyramidal tract is a 2-neuron pathway, upper motor neuron and the lower motor neuron. So what are the differences between the upper motor neuron and the lower motor neuron and the descending pathways? That is pyramidal and extrapyramidal and extrapyramidal. So how do we differentiate between pyramidal and extrapyramidal? Extrapyramidal, because extrapyramidal, it is concerned with maintenance of tone, posture and equilibrium and the execution of planning and programming also. So how do we differentiate between UMN and LMN lesion? That is a part of the descending tract. And how do we differentiate between the pyramidal and extrapyramidal system of the descending tract? Okay, so this is the pyramidal and extrapyramidal, and this figure, it represents the corticospinal and corticobulbar tract, and this is the first slide. Okay, so first of all, I will start with the descending tract. I told you that this descending tract and pyramidal, and among it the pyramidal, it consists of only 2 order neurons, first order and second order. The first order we refer to as upper motor neuron, and the second order we refer to as lower motor neuron. Okay, I will come to this upper motor neuron and lower motor neuron, as this is the corticopyramidal tract. This is a diagram or the figure of the pyramidal tract. This is pyramidal tract. Okay, pyramidal tract. I will come to it very briefly. Just I want to discuss the features of the pyramidal, but what is extrapyramidal tract? So how do we differentiate between the pyramidal and extrapyramidal? Pyramidal versus the extrapyramidal. Pyramidal versus extrapyramidal. Extrapyramidal. So at this point, if I tell you that this extrapyramidal is represented by descending tracts, they are represented by reticulospinal tract, tectospinal, olivospinal, vestibulospinal, rubrospinal, and reticulospinal. Okay, reticulospinal. So they all represent the descending extrapyramidal tract. Tectospinal means it is coming from the tectum of the midbrain. Olivospinal means from the inferior olivary nucleus of the medulla. Okay, vestibulospinal, that means the first order neuron is arising from the vestibular nuclei of the medulla or the brain stem. Then the reticulospinal from the reticular formation of the brain stem, and the rubrospinal again from the red nucleus of the brain, midbrain. Okay, each having some definite functions. Together we label it as extrapyramidal system. And the overall function of the extrapyramidal system, you remember that the overall function of this extrapyramidal system, it is the maintenance of tone, posture and equilibrium. And also, as it has connections with the basal ganglia, it is involved in planning and programming of movements. Okay, so tone, posture, equilibrium, planning and programming of the movements. And one important thing is that it innervates large group of muscles. So how does it works? It innervates. It works by innervating the large group of muscles. Large muscle group. That means if we are talking of our upper limb, the large muscle group will involve flexor of the forearm or arm. These are the large muscle group. Or the extensor of the arm and the forearm. They are comprising the large muscle group. While the muscles of the hand, they are the smaller muscle groups. Okay. Likewise, this large muscle group, it is present in the lower limb also. Okay, in the lower limb, in case of thigh, flexor and extensor aspect of the thigh, The flexor and extensor aspect of the leg, they all include the large muscle group. While in the foot, we have the smaller muscle groups. So smaller muscle groups, they are innervated by the pyramidal, and the larger muscle groups, they are innervated by the extrapyramidal system. So now we come on to the main discussion on the differences between the pyramidal and extrapyramidal system. It consists of corticospinal, that is the pyramidal tract, and the corticonuclear, or also called as corticobulbar. The only difference is that corticospinal, that means the first order neuron is reaching up to the spinal cord because it has to travel with the spinal nerve. While here in the corticonuclear or the corticobulbar, it is reaching up to the bulb. Bulb means it is reaching up to the brain stem, okay, or in the medulla. So it is called as corticonuclear because it will be distributed via the nuclei of the cranial nerves. They are innervating the nuclei of the cranial nerves. Just you can remember that the first order neurons, okay, from the cerebral cortex, it is innervating the nuclei of the cranial nerves that are located in the brain stem. Why it is essential? Because we have to bring the movement of our head and neck region, some localized areas of head and neck region. That means we have to produce our voice by the movement of the muscles of the palate, or the movement of the muscles of the tongue, or the movement of the muscles of the vocal cords, or the pharynx, or the larynx, or the muscles of the facial expression. All these are brought about by the contraction or the information motor carried by the cranial nerves. Okay, so that's why called as corticobulbar. While it consists of reticospinal, tectospinal, rubro, vestibulo, and olivospinal tract that we have discussed, they are arising from the cerebral cortex or the motor cortex or the area 4 of the cerebral cortex, while they are arising from subcortical centers such as the red nucleus in the brainstem, tectum in the brainstem, reticular formation, olivary, and the vestibular nuclei, and they innervate the anterior horn cells, that is in the ventral horn. Anterior horn cells, they are of two types, alpha and beta motor neurons, and they are also innervating the anterior horn cells. Both are bringing their activity, modulating the activity of the anterior horn cells, both pyramidal and the extrapyramidal system. Now both are part of the upper motor neuron. Okay, don't make it as in your understanding. Don't take the impression that it is one is upper motor and one. No, both are the upper motor neurons. Both are under the upper motor neurons. Both are upper motor neurons. Both pyramidal and extrapyramidal. Okay, and extrapyramidal. Both are upper motor neurons because they are innervating the activity of alpha and gamma motor neurons. And those alpha and gamma motor neurons, basically, they are the lower motor neurons or the second order neurons. Okay, second order in neurons in case of pyramidal, or it is polysynaptic. It can be 3rd or 4th order neuron. For extrapyramidal, you don't have to remember the number of neurons for extrapyramidal. Just remember it is polysynaptic. Okay, but here this pyramidal, it is just the 2 order neurons. It is 2 order neurons. 2 order neurons, while it is polysynaptic. It is polysynaptic. It is also one of the difference between the pyramidal and extrapyramidal. So what will happen? Impulse will reach the anterior horn cells directly. They are concerned with voluntary skillful movements. I have told you that voluntary skillful movements of the smaller group of muscles. And what will happen when there is lesion of this upper motor neuron? Okay, and this upper pyramidal system is comparatively recent in evolution, and this is older in evolution. Okay, it follows the complex indirect pathways that I wish to mention you. Polysynaptic circuitry, indirect pathways, complex activity involving the motor cortex, basal ganglia, limbic system, cerebellum, and the nuclei of the brain stem. And that's why these multisynaptic, polysynaptic connections, they are concerned with the planning and programming of the movement. Okay, so maintenance of the tone, posture, equilibrium, planning, and programming, they're all concerned with the function of the extrapyramidal system. Then in the pyramidal tract lesion leads to increased muscle tone. Now, what will happen if there is a lesion of the pyramidal or extrapyramidal? First of all, I will tell you how you remember between the pyramidal and extrapyramidal lesions. Now, both are upper motor neurons. Okay, both are upper motor neurons. So whenever there will be the lesion, it will be considered as the lesion of the upper motor neuron. It will be considered as the lesion of upper motor neuron. Okay. Now, in case of upper motor neuron, what happens? We have to discuss the difference of the upper motor and lower motor neuron. But as these both are the upper motor neuron, one is concerned with the skillful voluntary activity. So the patient will not be able to perform the skillful motor activity. That means he will not be able to paint or to eat the food or to draw something particular or to use his smaller fingers to perform a skilled motor activity if there is lesion of the upper motor neuron. While in the extrapyramidal system, it controls the muscle tone and posture. So the patient will not be able to maintain the tone, posture, and equilibrium that is concerned with the extrapyramidal. Now, having said that, it is important to discuss the upper and lower motor neuron lesions. Upper and lower motor neuron lesions. So for that, I have to go back and bring the slide that I left in the very beginning between the upper and the lower motor neuron lesions. How do we differentiate? This is the slide with the differences of the upper motor neuron and lower motor neuron. Now this upper motor and lower motor neuron, that means I am talking of the pyramidal system. I am talking of the pyramidal system. I am not talking of the extrapyramidal system. I am talking of the pyramidal system only. That has a two neuron pathway. That is a two neuron pathway. So what happens? You just remember that the upper motor neuron that controls the activity of the lower motor neuron. It controls the activity of lower motor neuron. Okay, it modulates the activity of lower motor neuron. How does it modulate the activity? It inhibits the activity of lower motor neuron. That means the upper motor neuron, it is somewhat inhibitory in nature. And what does it do? It inhibits the activity of lower motor neuron. So that means the lower motor neuron is excitatory, self-excitatory in nature. And if the impulses that arises from the anterior horn cells and that impulse is transmitted by means of anterior horn cells, it will innervate the group of muscles, whether the larger group of muscles in the extrapyramidal or smaller group of muscles in the pyramidal. But that will constitute the lower motor neuron. So what will happen if the lesion is at the level of the upper motor neuron? If there is lesion, so what will happen? Thus influence will cut off. It inhibits the activity, so that inhibition will be cut off. So it will become excitatory. The lower motor neuron, it will become excitatory on its own. Now what will happen if it will become excitatory on its own because of the lesion of the upper motor neuron? So there will be, because there will be a lesion of upper motor neuron. So in case of upper motor neuron, what will happen? It will become, in case of lesion is in the upper motor, so it will become self-excitatory. So there will be spasticity. The muscle will go into the spasm. There will be atrophy, but that atrophy will not be so much marked. The atrophy is because of disuse atrophy. There will be atrophy of the muscles. Okay, that will be disuse atrophy. The muscle will not be paralyzed because it is innervated by the alpha motor neuron. It is already intact. But there will be spasm, and we refer to as spasticity. So muscle atrophy is not there, but there is spastic paralysis. Okay, spastic paralysis. So going by the definition, paralysis means you are not able to move or use that limb. But here the case is that the innervation to the muscle by the lower motor neuron is intact, and that because of intact, it is repeatedly going into a state of contraction, and because of that repeated state of the contraction, it develops spasm, and that is called as spastic paralysis. It is because of the loss of the higher inhibitory control. The higher inhibitory control is lost. Okay, so the muscles are not completely paralyzed. But the voluntary control is lost. Voluntary control, upper motor neuron means the voluntary control. Now you will not be able to move the muscle. Okay, you will not be able to move because that voluntary control by the upper motor neuron has been lost. Only there will be spastic paralysis and there will be atrophy of the muscle. Atrophy per se will not be there. It is because of atrophy because you are not able to use that muscle, and that is called as spastic paralysis. And all the other reflexes, because the lower motor neuron is intact, so all the reflexes will become increased, exaggerated tendon reflexes, and that there is important sign to elicit and that is called as Babinski sign. Babinski sign becomes positive. Okay. So what happens? There is increase in the gamma motor discharge of the lower motor neuron, and superficial reflexes, all the superficial will be absent. Abdominal, cremastric, anal, they are all lost due to the corticospinal, and Babinski sign is positive. So in the upper motor neuron, just remember that the voluntary control to the muscle is lost, and you will not be able to move the muscle on your own will, and there will be spasticity or spasm. The deep tendon reflexes, they all will be exaggerated, while the superficial tendon reflexes will be lost, and there will be atrophy secondary to the disuse, and there will be hemiplegia. Okay, there will be hemiplegia. Now, what is this Babinski sign? Babinski sign is nothing but once we stroke the heel, that sole of the foot, once we stroke the sole of the foot, stroke the sole of the foot. If we stroke the sole of the foot by any sharp object, then there is movement of the fingers. And the normal movement of the finger is the plantar extension. It is the plantar extension, plantar movement of the fingers. Okay. Plantar movements. That means the great toe and rest of the other toes, they are moved in the direction of the sole. So there is plantar flexion of the great toe and the other digits. While that is the normal response. While what happens in case of Babinski, when the corticospinal tract, the inhibition of the corticospinal tract is lost, then this will not take place, and accordingly there will be extensor response. Extensor response. So that means there will be extensor movement of the first toe. Extensor movement of the first toe. First toe आप कैसे move करेगा? Extensor aspect में move करेगा. हाँ जी, everything is fine, Dr. Nurul.
Fine.
Okay. So till what time? I just need 10-15 more minutes. I will be.
You take 10 minutes, not the issue. Continue.
Okay, no problem. Just I will take 10 more minutes. No issue. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you. So we have discussed the upper motor neuron lesion. Just you have to remember that it is the atrophy is mild. Okay, because it is already innervated by the gamma motor. That is the lower motor neuron, and the reflexes will be exaggerated, while all the reflexes will be exaggerated. The deep reflexes, the superficial will be absent. The deep reflexes will be exaggerated because the discharge is continuously there, and the muscle will go in a state of tone. Increased spasm or tonicity will be there. Okay, it will be hypertonic. Increased tone will be there. So all these are very important terms. Becomes hypertonic. It shows spastic paralysis. Okay, there is atrophy, but it is mild, only mild atrophy. We have exaggerated deep tendon reflexes, and the superficial tendon reflexes are absent, and the Babinski sign is positive. While in the lower motor neuron lesion, as I can give you a practical example, you have seen the patients of the poliomyelitis. That was an illness that was very common in the yesteryears. So what happens if you have seen the case of a person suffering from the polio, then all his muscle of the lower limb or the upper limb, whatever the group of muscle is involved, it becomes totally wasted. The muscle is totally wasted. It is flaccid. Patient is able to move that muscle, but it becomes completely flaccid. Okay, so what happens in case of poliomyelitis? In case of poliomyelitis, the lesion is at the level of the lower motor neuron. Lower motor neuron. Okay, so the lower motor neuron, it innervates the muscle group, so that innervation to the muscle group is lost. So first of all, the muscle will get atrophy. It will become wasted. It undergoes complete atrophy due to paralysis, due to disuse atrophy. Okay, so that paralysis, because of the loss of the innervation of the lower motor neuron, it is called as flaccid paralysis. Here it was referred to as spastic paralysis. So you remember the spastic paralysis versus the flaccid paralysis. Okay, and usually it affects the single muscle because this alpha motor neuron, it innervates the single muscle. Babinski cannot be elicited because it is only sign of the upper motor neuron lesion, and all the superficial and deep reflexes are lost. All the superficial and deep reflexes are lost. Here you have to example, remember the case of the Bell's palsy. Poliomyelitis. Facial paralysis and poliomyelitis will be wasting and will not be able to move the limb, ascending rest. Now we have discussed the upper motor differences between upper and the lower motor neurons. Okay, now we come to the discussion, continual discussion about the pyramidal tract. Pyramidal tract. Now this is the pyramidal tract. Okay, having the corticospinal and corticobulbar neurons, fibers, taking their origin from the motor areas of the cerebral cortex, and that motor areas, it is located in the area 4 of the Broadwells, area 4, or located in the precentral sulcus. Precentral sulcus. Here, it is also important to remember the inverted homunculus concept. Inverted homunculus. You have, if you remember the inverted human, you can see your physiology books. There they have given the good diagrams of the inverted human. They have drawn a picture where there is a human that is lying on this part of the cerebral cortex, an image of which you can remember which areas of these corticospinal tracts that are controlled by that particular part of the cerebral cortex. I'm not going into the details. So here the first order neurons taking the origin from this area 4, and they are going downwards. Again, it is a single axon. So this single axon, it is traversing this part of the cortex. Then the lower, it traverses the lower areas of the brain, and when it traverses the lower areas of the brain, it lies between some other nuclei. That means it lies between the thalamus medially and the basal ganglia laterally. Here it is important that this part, this region within the confines of the brain, it is referred to as internal capsule. So if I draw the internal capsule over here, it is somewhat like this. This is the region or a pathway or a part, okay, or a highway that we refer to as internal capsule. So this internal capsule is nothing but a sort of a highway which is located within the brain, between the nucleus, between the caudate nucleus and the basal ganglia, and it has that particular pathway or region or is called as area is called as internal capsule. Again, this internal capsule has one anterior limb. This is the anterior limb of the internal capsule. This part is called as genu of the internal capsule. This is the posterior limb of the internal capsule. There can be a separate class on the internal capsule. It is important. Why? Because all the fibers that are converging from the larger areas of the cerebral cortex, now the traffic of those fibers, they diverge to a smaller point. You can remember this. These are the smaller or narrower highways. It is a very narrower highway that all the traffic has to pass through this narrower highway. So what will happen? Any accident in this region of narrower pathway, it will lead to a very widespread or very damaging effect. So even what happens if there is a very small bleed in this region of the internal capsule, that happens in case of stroke, or that happens in case of intracerebral hemorrhage. Majority of the times the cerebral hemorrhage patients, they suffer from stroke. The bleeding is at the level of this region only, in the region of posterior limb of the internal capsule. The bleeding is over here in the posterior limb of the internal capsule. Okay, majority of the times it is involved. And once this posterior limb is involved, then the majority of the fibers that are corticospinal in nature. So the corticospinal fibers that they are passing from the posterior limb of the internal capsule. Just I want to say that they are passing from the posterior limb of internal capsule. So if they are involved, what will happen? It will lead to a very widespread effect. Okay, very widespread effect. So they traverses the internal capsule, then they passes through the midbrain. Which part? Anterior part of the midbrain. So it is passing through the anterior part of the midbrain. Then it passes through the pons. And then from the pons, ventral aspect of the pons, it comes into the medulla. And in the medulla, there is an area, the surface projection of which you can see in the face of surface elevation. That area is called as pyramids. And here these tracks, the corticospinal tracks, they cross to the opposite side. Forming the great motor decussation or the pyramidal decussation. So here they are crossing and forming the pyramidal decussation. Okay, at the level of medulla, medullary pyramid. Now some of the fibers will cross to the opposite side and they will continue to run in the lateral column of the spinal cord, forming the lateral corticospinal tract in the lateral column. While some of the fibers, they remain uncrossed and those they remain uncrossed, only the 15 or 10% are there, and the rest 85% they cross. So those that are uncrossed and they travel in the anterior column, and they form the anterior corticospinal tract. They form the anterior corticospinal tract. The modalities are different. Sorry, now they are what they are carrying. There is the motor fibers, so they innervate the lower motor neuron. They are not the sensory fibers. So we have discussed the corticospinal. Now what will be the effect of the lesion? Effect of the lesion. Now rest of the fibers, these are the extrapyramidal. Just you remember the names of this extrapyramidal and names and functions. General functions will be to facilitate the movement, tone, to maintain the tone, posture, equilibrium. So reticulospinal, it facilitates, inhibits the voluntary movement or reflex activity. Tectospinal, postural movement in response to visual stimuli. That it is called as visuospinal reflex. Visuospinal reflex. Then the rubrospinal from the red nucleus. What does it do? It controls the activity of flexor muscles and inhibits the activity of extensor muscle. Every action is to maintain the tone and posture. Okay? By inhibiting some muscles and facilitating some muscle, it is able to maintain the tone and the posture. Okay. So rubrospinal and vestibulospinal, that again facilitate extensor and inhibits flexor group. Again maintains the tone and the posture. Nothing more to remember. We have discussed in detail about this slide. This is just the location of dorsal column, fasciculus, gracilis, cuneatus. These are the ascending. Dorsal spinocerebellar, ventral spinocerebellar, and this is the lateral spinothalamic tract. And these are the in the red figure we have the spinothalamic, these descending tracts, and here we are the ascending tracts. Now what is this? Leave it. Motor neuron and lower motor neuron we have seen this. One more difference is that there are fasciculations. That is the repeated movement of the muscle. You can observe that muscle is contracting on its own, and when it will contract only when the lower motor neuron is there. So fasciculations, they are seen in case of upper motor, because once the lower motor neuron is intact. So this is, you have to remember that the lower motor neuron is intact. You will forget this slide, I tell you. Okay, just remember the fasciculations, they are observed. Fasciculations, this means there is involuntary contraction of the muscle. And that involuntary contraction of the muscle will be seen only when the lower motor neuron is intact. So in case of UMN lesions are there, then the muscle will contract on its own. So there will be fasciculations. Okay. There will be fasciculations in case of upper motor neuron lesion, because the lower motor neuron is intact and it is sending the impulse. So the muscle is contracting on its own. So there are fasciculation. When the lower motor is gone, then that means everything is gone. Okay, there will be complete paralysis. Everything is gone. So now there are some of the disease of the lower of the motor neuron. Poliomyelitis we have discussed. Poliomyelitis that involves the anterior horn cells. Okay, and that is the lower motor neuron type of palsy. Or ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. Okay, again this is anterior horn cells, but it involves the upper motor neuron type of lesion. So it involves the pyramidal tract and the anterior horn cells. So it is basically upper motor neuron type of lesion that we called as ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. Okay. Now, very important condition that is associated with the spinal cord, a clinical condition is called as Brown-Sequard syndrome. That is called as Brown-Sequard syndrome. Brown-Sequard syndrome. This Brown-Sequard syndrome is called as hemisection of the spinal cord. This is described under hemisection of spinal cord. That means you have only, the section is only one. The injury is one, that it is involving only on one side and are reaching up to the central canal. The other side of the spinal cord is intact. So the thing is that as an anatomy students, you have to remember that what will happen in case of hemisection of the spinal cord. because with the information that I have given you about the ascending and descending tracks, you have to remember that what tracks cross over and what does not cross over, or what crosses over at a higher level. Okay. So if suppose if there is a section of the spinal cord, so what will happen on the same side and what will happen on the opposite side? So on the same side, if the section or the injury is over here, okay, so this is the same side. So what will happen in the same side and what will happen in the opposite side? So first of all, you remember that from the opposite side, we have the modalities of the sensation, pain and temperature. So loss of pain and temperature will be there. Loss of pain and temperature because it crosses over. It is carried by the lateral spinothalamic tract, lateral and ventral spinothalamic tract. You remember that it crosses over, okay, either at the same level or one or two levels above. So there is loss of pain and temperature at the opposite side. While what will happen, the same side, you remember the posterior column, it is going to the level of the medulla, and there is the nucleus gracilis and cuneatus, and now this great sensory decussation is taking place. So what happens? It is the loss will be at the same level, at the same side. So loss of the proprioception that is carried by the posterior column. Okay, it is on the same side. It is affected on the same side. So proprioceptive impulses, that is loss of joint position, vibration, 2-point discrimination, tactile localization, that is affected on the same side, while the pain and temperature is lost on the opposite side. So you remember this condition where there is loss of temperature on the opposite side and proprioceptive sensation, that is the posterior column, on the same side. Okay. And what about the corticospinal fibers? Again, the corticospinal fibers have crossed at the level of the medulla. Okay. So now once they are descending down up to the anterior horn cells, and they will bring effect at the same level because the injury is here and the lower down fibers, they are involved. So now the injury will be at the same side. So that same side will result in the loss of voluntary movement at the same side. Okay, so upper motor neuron paralysis will be on the same side. Okay, that will involve the spastic paralysis of the same side. Fasciculations on the same side, group of muscles, fasciculations on the same side. Proprioceptive sensation is lost. Okay, and the pain and temperature is unaffected. Here only the pain and temperature is affected. So this is about this spinal injuries, that is the Brown-Sequard syndrome. That is the hemisection of the spinal cord, and you have to remember this hemisection of the spinal cord. Okay, so I think this was all from my side about the internal organization and the internal structure of the spinal cord, and I hope that you have benefited from this lecture, and there is much more available in your textbooks and in literature about the clinical conditions and diseases, but here the basics you have to remember, and you have to build your knowledge based on the basics, and you have to build accordingly. Okay, so I thank you all for your time and patience, and I thank you the MedSkill Academy, and Dr. Nurul, I thank you in person for giving me this opportunity to present my lecture to your students. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dr. Sam, for your time, and this is very energetic, and throughout the session, though it's say 2 hour long lecture, but from beginning to end, highly energetic and highly engaging, and you are giving all the thing in a very depth and in a very lucid and easy way. So I am very pretty sure that those who are want to understand this spinal cord, they will easily get it very well, and they would be applying it in their when they would be going to the higher classes. So it's a very basic knowledge and very good, all the differences and all the basic concepts with these intricacies and all we have discussed very in depth and in a very lucid and easy way. So I'm sure that they will getting the advantage of it. Thanks, Dr. Sam, for joining us on Sunday and giving your precious time. We have two lectures also for the day. One is for physiology and that is for biochemistry. So we'll connecting again at 2 o'clock. We are here only, but we will be joining again. So I'm keeping my microphone off and video off. So joining again, and thanks again, Dr. Saim. I'll discuss you on phone for future plan and all of this. So we'll discuss regarding that. Thank you. Thanks for sparing the time. Thanks a lot. Yes, Dr. Gohar, I'm just renaming your, you have your system's name just for you. So I have made you co-host, Professor Gohar. Thanks for joining again for our physiology class. We are going to cover cardiovascular system now, the rest topic which we have left in last weekend class. So, because just for